as people pop in, we are going to get started with MCF's Manatee Connects event. And I have my dog here in the background, so apologies if the noise level rises. The first step in addressing community needs together is to understand them. So thank you for taking the time to learn about the state of the region from United Way Suncoast at this Manatee Connects Manatee Community Foundation webinar. I'm Veronica Thames, Manatee Community Foundation's CEO, and here with me virtually are Simone Peterson, Community Investment Officer, Sarah Bostick, Executive Assistant and Office Manager, and so many members of the Philanthropy team. We have Jennifer Evans, our consultant, and our friends with United Way and with Credit Union One. Our mission at MCF is to partner with our citizens to strengthen and enhance our community through philanthropy, education, and service now and forever. We were established as the only community foundation in Manatee that serves the entire county and beyond back in 1998, and have since infused our community with over $66 million and many initiatives to support key community challenges from childcare to disaster response and animal welfare and beyond. And now a couple of housekeeping rules for our webinar today. Our speaker is happy to entertain questions along the way. So just add them to the Q&A chat and you'll remain muted as a participant, but we will rise those questions up to Doug to address. The webinar is also being recorded, so we will be sharing it in the future. We will also follow up with an email that includes a survey to learn how we did today in this webinar and what we can improve and what you'd like to hear about in the future and other Manatee Connect offerings. The link to the recording will be provided as well in the presentation that Doug will share with us today. And let me remind you that we do a lot of Manatee Connects webinars and in-person trainings and investments in our nonprofit partners capacity. So be sure that you are part of our offerings by learning about them through our newsletter. Just join via manateecf.org. United Way's mission is to provide leadership that improves lives, creates lasting community change by mobilizing the caring people, our communities, to give, advocate, and volunteer. Thank you, Stella, for joining the conversation. And with that, this organization provides pathways Stella to education. I should have put her in her cage to improve community. And with that, we very much value our partnership. And Doug, we're so grateful you are here. And the ALICE information that you learn will be critical to making strategic decisions and choosing the approach of your organization to improve our community. So I'm very excited again, you chose to join us. And with that, before Doug takes stage, let me introduce to you the Vice President of Community Impact at United Way Suncoast and Doug Griesenauer, and our partner from Credit Union One, Maria Evie, who has made our financial empowerment initiatives possible. So she's here to share some remarks. She and I go way back. So I'll let her introduce herself, but I'm grateful for she and Sherrod Halliburton's investments in our community that deeply affect and impact our community nonprofit organizations and their ability to make strategic decisions to rise up our ALICE population and elevate their quality of life. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for enduring, Stella. And Maria, please take the stage.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for having us. And we all love seeing a dog in the background, so I don't think you have anything to worry about. I'm Maria Avey. As Veronica mentioned, I'm VP of Partnership Developments for Credit Union One. And Michael Fluker is our Financial Wellness Manager. Our team is very committed to the financial wellness of the people that live in our communities. And we have a financial wellness program that we provide for employers for their employees. And we started having conversations with Doug and Jennifer and Veronica of the importance as nonprofit employers that our employees are working with clients and understanding their financial situation, because a lot of times our employees that we hire them with grant dollars. We hire them with very tight, budgets, because we're nonprofits and we can only hire so many people with the money that we receive from grants. So we thought that it would be very important to share with all of you what Credit Union One can help with a financial wellness plan for your employees, but more importantly, what United Way does in our community. And Doug, I will do his bio, but I would be remiss if I don't mention when I was the United Way Suncoast Sarasota area president, I hired Doug to come to United Way Suncoast. So this is like full circle for us. And I just have so much respect for him. And he really loves this work. So I will read his bio. He's the Vice President of Community Impact at United Way Suncoast. He's going to deliver a report to all of us. Let me share a few words about him. Serving his community at United Way for the past decade and working in 3 different anti-poverty research centers. Before that, Doug is committed to ensuring the communities have the best tools at their disposals to help families receive what they need to be successful in whatever they do. With a master's in social work from Washington University in St. Louis, Doug works to connect national best practices with local understandings of the community so that our communities can do the smarter work for their families. And just a little bit, he is committed and his heart is in this work. So I introduce Doug, and Doug, take it away.
Thanks, Maria. It's always fun when I get to work with Maria because, as we mentioned, my first couple of years here, we got to work in the same building together in this right next door. So it was a lot of fun. But yes, hey everybody, my name is Doug Griesenauer. I'm with United Way Suncoast, and I am here to talk to you all about Alice, but particularly, as was mentioned, about Alice in the nonprofit space. We have a lot of nonprofit partners and nonprofit adjacent partners in the audience today. I'm reading the attendees, and I have some friends in the room, which is always fun. But I'm here to talk to you again about Alice, about the state of Alice, and really not only how many people are struggling, which some of you probably heard Alice before, you know that, but what can we do about it? And how can we build up a community that can be resilient to some of these financial struggles? So I'm going to share my screen, but once I do that, it means I can't see you all anymore. And so I leave it to you all to be able to, share your questions and really make this as interactive as possible as we go through. So before I get started, can you all see my PowerPoint that should be saying, what is Alice? Is that correct? All right, good. Thanks, Maria. So I'm here, to talk to you about Alice, specifically in the Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto area, because a lot of us are from that space. Just to give you some context, United Way Suncoast carries Sarasota, Manatee, DeSoto, as well as Hillsborough and Pinellas County. We'll be focusing mostly on the first 3, and again, a focus on the nonprofit providers as we talk about this. So some of you have heard me say this before, and bear with me if you have, but what is Alice? Why do we have it? Why does it exist? A lot of people say, well, if you have a measurement of how many people are struggling, why don't you just use the federal poverty line? And I always use that as an opportunity to dig into the federal poverty line because I do not like it. It was created back in the 1960s, actually by a very well-meaning and intelligent researcher named Dr. Molly Orshansky, who took the most recent data she had available to her, which was 1955 U.S. Department of Agriculture food data, that at that time there was a cost of a basket of goods for high, medium, and a low family household income style. She took that low basket of goods, multiplied it by 3, called it the federal poverty line. That is the federal poverty line we use today, and there was no intention for it to be used as widespread as it was. But any history buffs back there know that back in the 60s, our president, Lyndon B. Johnson, declared a war on poverty. And when you declare a war on poverty, you need a measurement tool to see how you're doing on that. And they picked the federal poverty line. And so the federal poverty line wasn't intended to be used as intensely. It was supposed to be this initial measurement of how many people are struggling in America, but instead has now been linked to all these benefits, linked to all these other supports and services, which makes it significantly bigger than it needs to be. The problem with that is that that federal poverty line, because it wasn't built for these purposes, isn't matched by geography, right? Federal poverty line for DeSoto County is the same in South Sarasota and the same as Manhattan, New York, which is ridiculous, right? Federal poverty line for a family of 4, if you have a single mom with 3 young kids, is a federal poverty line for a family of 4 with 2 adults and 2 high school kids. And no one in their right mind thinks that those 2 families cost the same amount of money, except for the federal poverty line. And so when we talk about this, insert ALICE as a solution to solve this. What ALICE is, as I like to say, is a fairly serious topic with a fairly silly acronym for individuals who are asset limited, income constrained, but employed, hence spelling ALICE. But really what you should know is it's a dollar threshold that recalculates how much it costs to get by based on our current cost. It's not just looking at that food plan divided by 3, geography, and family type. And again, all of this, and we'll be able to send the PowerPoints to you all in a PDF later, so you can use these 2 links that are available here so that you can pull on this data as well. Especially for you all, we are also going to be talking about ALICE in the nonprofit workforce. So there was a report that United for ALICE released that talks about what is ALICE in the nonprofit workforce. Now, I will tell you that this report is a national report. And so just for housekeeping, anytime we're talking about the nonprofit sector for ALICE, these will be using national numbers. And anytime we talk about any other ALICE data, it'll be using local data, just so you're aware of those pieces. So speaking locally, when we talk about who is ALICE, in Florida, we have about 8.9 million households. And of those, 4.2 million have an income below the ALICE threshold. It's about 45%. And locally, we can keep those same trends. So again, across all of United Way's 5-county area, we have 658,000 households, of which 100,000 of them are single-parent households. And then here in Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties, we still have 180,000 households, or 43% of all households living below that ALICE threshold. Interestingly, when you break it down by employment type, again, across the nation, what we find is that nonprofit employees actually tend to have lower ALICE rates than for-profit employees and self-employed, but not quite as good as government employees. Now, we'll dive deeper into this because not all nonprofit individuals are created equal in these payments and in these spaces. And so when we talk about what a nonprofit employee is, well, what it means is it is one of the 14 million workers in the nonprofit community across the nation. And of those 15 million, about 3 million, or 22% of the total, are below the ALICE threshold. And now I'll go into this chart, which shows that these are not all the same, right? When you talk about what a nonprofit is, there's a lot of you all are social service agencies, or you in the educational space, but it also includes those who are in the healthcare space. A lot of our hospitals are nonprofit hospitals. A lot of our museums, a lot of our religious organizations, a lot of our other institutions and groups that are nonprofits are nonprofits, right? And so that nonprofit is a different size and different shape depending on what kind of nonprofit you are. And so this breaks it down by these different groups in which the darker colored blue in each of these pies is the share of the ALICE threshold. And the size of the circle is the total workers in our nation who are in the nonprofit space. So as we can see here, healthcare and educational services tend to be the largest. And healthcare, again, with a lot of those hospitals, are at 16%. And I say that because, again, if you are a doctor working at a nonprofit hospital, you work at a nonprofit. If you are a service worker working in a nonprofit, you also work at a nonprofit. And so again, when we talk about, and I'll jump back in 2 seconds, this area where the nonprofits are lower in poverty and lower in ALICE, which is a great thing, keep in mind that that is not equitably distributed. And so the highest rates of ALICE among nonprofits are those in nonprofit retail. So again, those nonprofits that are still providing retail benefits and services. We see this similarly in the for-profit space where retail is a pretty high rate of ALICE. It's also true in the nonprofit space. But more important, especially for this group, arts and rec and social assistance are the second highest rates of ALICE among nonprofit communities. And a lot of you all fit in that social assistance pie. And so again, when we talk about the ALICE populations, about 32% of all individuals in that social assistance space are below ALICE. And so again, I'll be talking about the nonprofit community as a whole, but I put this here because it's interesting that when you talk about nonprofits, you're talking about a lot of different people all at once. If this stuff is interesting to you, please go to our website, unitedforalice.org, and you can pull this report yourself. It's a fascinating one. It's about 30 some odd pages. So let's actually talk about ALICE, though, in general over time. When we're looking in Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties, what we've seen is that the percentages of people below ALICE are staying about stable, but the numbers are increasing, and they are continuously increasing. So if you look in 2019 and 2021, we were at about 40% or so population below ALICE. Now we're closer to 43, which again, for context, is better than the 45% of the state. But when you look at the raw numbers, what we see is from 2019 to 2023, 40,000 more people are in our communities who are below the ALICE threshold and who are struggling. And so again, if you start feeling, if you've been working at a nonprofit for over time and you start noticing that things seem to be getting a little busier, people are asking for more assistance, the requests are increasing, well, you're not making it up, right? It's true. There are 40,000 more people below the ALICE threshold, 40,000 more people who are in need of assistance and supports. And so when we talk about the nonprofit community, not only talking about ourselves that are sometimes in ALICE and struggling, but our services to the community continuously are adding more and more stressors because there are more and more people who are struggling. And we talk about what that means and who's in the workforce, right? We just looked at the nonprofit community, and those service areas are about 1 in 3 are struggling. But it's not just nonprofit groups. The top 20 occupations in the state have 1/3 of all employees below that ALICE threshold. Making accounting and bookkeepers have 1 in 4. Registered nurses are 1 in 7, and elementary and middle school teachers, 1 in 5 of them are struggling financially. And so yes, individuals in the nonprofit space are below ALICE, but also a lot of other spaces struggle in this space too. So this is a giant chart that everyone tells me to get rid of, but I love it. And so it's going to stay in these presentations because it shows so much impressive data. But some of you might be a little shocked at the number of numbers on this chart. So let me walk through it with you for a sec. This shows the ALICE household survival budget for selected counties. I selected Sarasota and Manatee counties in Florida. You'll notice I didn't include DeSoto on this one, and that's because DeSoto does bring down the averages pretty considerably, and I'll talk about that in a second. On the top, we mentioned how the federal poverty line doesn't consider a family of 4 and their household type based on numbers. Well, ALICE does. So if you look at the third from the right, just for an example, we have 2 adults with 2 kids in childcare. If you look just at that column, just at that third from the right, and bring your eyes down to the bottom, you see that in Sarasota and Manatee counties, that family of 4 needs $99,000 to get by. We can round that up with an extra $270 into $100,000 for that family to get by. And when I say get by, I mean, look at the cost of housing here, right? A family of 4 paying monthly costs of $1,859 for housing and childcare at $1,667. If you can find childcare for $800 a kid in our communities, please let me know. Because there are a lot of people that are needing childcare assistance and are paying more than that. There are a lot of people in our community that are paying more than that for housing for a 2-bedroom house or apartment, right? But even with these conservative numbers, it costs $100,000 to get by in our community. And again, I keep this chart up here because in the past, if I said, where's a family, they make $100,000, you wouldn't think that they were on the precipice of financial struggle, right? But a lot of these cases, people are, because it's just expensive these days to live. And so keep in mind, of course, that these households then fluctuate, right? If you were lucky to have generational housing where you're able to live in your parents' house, well, then your housing costs are lower, and that's better for you, and you might be able to get by with a little less. If, for example, you have a child that's a special needs child or has severe health issues, well, now that's going to cost a lot more. And so your costs will fluctuate there too. So again, keep in mind that this 100,000 is a conservative average of how much it costs to get by in our community. But that's why so many people are struggling. And so if you didn't like that giant chart of numbers, here's a pretty graph to show you a similar situation of looking at that household survival budget, breaking it down by these bars. And you can see now I'm looking at more general across the state of Florida data, but it's about 86,000 in order to get by. So that's the average of what's going on. I mentioned Sarasota and DeSoto counties are at 99, or sorry, Sarasota and Manatee counties are at 99,000. DeSoto is actually much less at 77,000 because DeSoto happens to be a more rural community that has less expensive costs, right? But even so, if you take two of the most common jobs in Florida, which would be a stock worker and a personal care aide, it is nowhere near enough to make up for those costs that are the expenses of what's going on. And I threw the federal poverty line in this chart just for kicks to show you how horrible that tool really is. So I'm going to take a beat here because I have been talking pretty quickly because there's a lot of good data here. But I want to go a little bit more slowly now on some of these pieces to talk about really what it means to be struggling, right? When we talk about being in Alice, when we talk about being financially insecure, it means you are trying to decide where you're going to be putting your costs, right? It's talking about where you are going to be able to spend for things like swim lessons for your kids or summer camps. I say that because I have kids in summer camp and then we're going to swim lessons this afternoon and all of that costs money, right? And so when you're talking about these Alice rates, it's about making choices in these spaces. But not all families make these choices equally. And so here is an interesting chart about nonprofit wages and household financial status. And so what's interesting is that what we find is a lot of individuals that are working in nonprofit spaces, they might have a spouse that is not in the nonprofit space, and that might be making considerably more money. And so what you see here on this bar graph, if you look at the biggest one, the sort of goldenrod color, there are about 49% of people in the nonprofit space that have their wage and their households above the Alice threshold, which is nice. You then go to this darker orange, and there are places where your wage might be below the Alice threshold, but the household is above. That means that an individual is working in the nonprofit space. They might not be making a lot, but they might have a partner that's able to compensate for that, for what's going on. And so this is really interesting. That shows that a lot of individuals in the nonprofit space happen to have a partner that almost subsidizes their living, right? That allows them to be above that Alice threshold and therefore allows them to maybe take a job with a bit more passion, but a bit less pay in order for them to get by. But here's where the problem comes in. Because there are also 19% of individuals where their wage and their household is below that threshold, right? And a lot of those happen to be single parent households, right? Because if you're a single parent household, you are going to be either in that goldenrod or in that dark blue because your wage is the household income, right? If you're a single parent, you are the one income for that household. And so what we see here is a vast disparity in different household types leading to different financial levels of security. And so if you are a single parent and you're in the nonprofit space, there is a large chance that you will be struggling, which is unfortunate. And then we have a little sliver where your wage is above the Alice threshold, but your household is below. Again, that would be some nuance where if you're working at a nonprofit space and you yourself are making a decent wage, again, remember, not all nonprofits are created equal, but then you have a partner that makes less, which is causing your overall household income to drop down. So again, this showcases, again, that all households are different. And because of the household types, because of our household breakdowns, because of our family statuses and our life circumstances, our financial stressors could be very different than our neighbors. And we need to keep that in mind as we're building solutions that address our entire community and address all of the household types that we work through. Because again, we'll talk about solutions near the end, but that is important to know that when you're looking at building solutions that are helpful for families, Well, make sure you're considering single parents in that space as well, because they are families too, and they're families that are more likely to struggle. So again, I talked a lot at you really quickly. And so here are the things that you should pay attention to. If you pay attention to anything in this hour, is knowing that even more households are struggling below that ALICE threshold. That means that a lot of our community, a lot of people who we know, even possibly ourselves, are struggling these days. And it is hard to be financially secure. That statement also means that there are more people in our community struggling, which makes our jobs harder. And so we need to understand that as we're addressing the solutions to our community, what might have worked 5 years ago might be less effective now simply because there are more people struggling. And we need to understand that we can address this. What we also know is that the budgets have increased by about 8% from 2022 to 2023 across our community. And those budgets are expected to climb. Now, keep in mind, I said 2023, and anyone who's paying attention knows that we are not living in that year. And that is because the data that we use here are federal data. And therefore, there's always going to be a delay as the data gets cleaned, collected, and distributed. So the data that we're talking about here, all of these individuals struggling, that $100,000 threshold, that was true 2 years ago. It probably is even higher today if we were to take a snapshot. And lastly, I brought this up a couple minutes ago. I'll bring it up again, and I'll probably bring it up 2 or 3 more times at least. There are demographic discrepancies that continue across our community. And this is important to know as we're building our solutions so that we can build solutions that serve the whole families. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in charts and graphs, but as I do this, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those into the chat because I would love to be able to answer those as we keep going. Because again, there's a lot of data that I'm throwing at you. I hope you're not getting carpal tunnel by writing it all down because we will be sending this PDF to you all after the presentation. But let's dive briefly into some charts and graphs of what we see in our community. So here's a map of Florida. I hope you knew that. What it shows is that rural communities actually continue to have the highest ALICE rates, though there are pockets of every city that also has high concentrations of those below the ALICE threshold. This probably is no surprise to anyone in the nonprofit space or anyone who's been looking at mapping. But what's cool is that you can drill down even deeper with our maps when you're looking at this data again at United for ALICE. And so now what I did, instead of just looking at all of Florida, I looked at our communities in particular in the west central part of Florida. Again, you might see your zip code on this map. And so I want to spend a second, again, mostly we're talking about Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto here. I did want to sort of bring it back just a little bit so that you can look at these colors and just getting a feel for what's going on here. See that there are pockets of ALICE in literally every county. And in fact, when you look at every single county in the nation, there is not a single county that has 0% of individuals below the ALICE threshold. And so that means that every county, regardless of quality, still has individuals struggling. And that's important to note as we're building solutions. But let's dive down really specifically into some of those zip codes. And what I want to show you here is that there are significantly high percentages in our communities, even if our counties on average trend a little bit better than the state. So as a reminder, Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties have about 43% of our population below the ALICE threshold. The state of Florida is about 45% below the ALICE threshold. But then you look up in Bradenton, 34205, you look just south of that to 34207, we're looking at 61 and 66%, right? You're looking North Sarasota near the Newtown area, you're at 57%. And Arcadia, yes, it's cheaper, but also there's a lot of individuals that are struggling there. In fact, 60% of all Arcadian residents are struggling below the ALICE threshold. And so again, it's important to note that when we're looking at this work and we're looking at where to focus our work, we know that even if overall our counties are probably trending better than the state, there are significant populations of areas that we really do need to zero in on as we're doing our solutions and building our community solutions to these problems. And so let's look at families with children. for the SMD counties, SMD being Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto. I'll say SMD for the next few slides only because it's a lot to say those three all together. And let's break it down now by single and married household types. Again, people in the nonprofit space know this better than anyone else. The number of household types are as varied as the number of households in our community. But for the purposes of the data that we have, which is census data, they've just broken it down by three categories: married, single female, and single male-headed households. What's fascinating here is that married households have significantly higher rates above ALICE than their single parent counterparts. This probably isn't a surprise because if you are married, then you probably have two incomes, or one of your partners is able to stay home with the kids if you have kids, and then you're not paying for childcare, right? You're saving on costs, or you have increased income if you have more earners in that household. But just like I was talking about in the nonprofit space, if you're a single parent in general, you are more likely to struggle. We also know that single female-headed households are considerably more likely to struggle than their single male-headed counterparts because discrimination exists, right? Single female-headed households are considerably more likely to struggle. But here's something that's interesting is that when you look at the number of households that are single-parent households, there's about 20,000 of those single-parent households in our communities. And so just to give you some sense, because we're going to look at these graphs a bit in this formatting a couple times throughout this presentation. The goldenrod colors at the top are those that are above ALICE, which is good. The robin's egg blue are those that are in ALICE, which means they're above poverty, but they're not quite making enough to make ends meet. And at the bottom are those in poverty, that horribly broken tool that has been broken since it's been created. There are still people below that threshold. And you see, in fact, that about 30% of single female-headed households are below that poverty threshold. And then you look at the right of that grayscale. And what it shows you is of these categories, these are the percentages of the total households that are there, right? So that darkest black, that is the married households of all households. That's the percentage that's married. The darker gray is the single female, and the lighter gray is the single male-headed households. And so when looking at single parent households, we have about 20,000 households that are headed by a single parent. Now, the good news for Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto is that 28% is actually pretty good, comparatively speaking, to other parts of our state and other parts of the country. On average, the data that I've seen has actually been closer to 33% or 32 or so. So instead of there being 1 out of 3 parents headed by a single household, in our community, it's 1 out of 4. So that is something to be proud of. That is something good, but also note that it's 20,000 households that are struggling. And that's a lot of households. And so as we're building solutions, we need to keep those single parent households in mind as we're building this out. Now, also breaking that down again by men and women, what we see is when we look at the nonprofit wages and household financial status by sex, men have significantly higher median annual wages. And even if you're looking at families who are struggling below the ALICE threshold, men are still having slightly higher wages, even if they're struggling below that ALICE threshold. Again, the percentage of households below the ALICE threshold is about the same because of the household makeups that we talked about before. But lastly, looking at the percent where the wage is below the budget, yet the household is above the budget, that tends to flip here, right? Where women in nonprofit spaces tend to have a higher percentage where their wage is below, yet the household is above. That shows a little bit of gender dynamics here, in which a lot of, again, women tend to be struggling and making less. And if they are in, an opposite sex marriage, if you're female and your male has a counterpart there, they'll be more likely to make more. Again, moral of the story here is there is still, according to the data, severe pay discrepancies between the two genders. And this helps explain why. When you're looking at that nonprofit status by management, what we see is 2 things, maybe 3, but I see 2 things. Is 1, you're looking at these blue bars, those are our women. You look at those goldenrod bars, and those are our men. There are just more women in the nonprofit space than men, right? Again, you look around a room and you know this just by doing a head count. But what's interesting here is that that discrepancy gets smaller and smaller as we get closer to different levels and higher levels of management. And so women still are higher than men from non-manager to CEO. But that discrepancy does get smaller and smaller here, meaning not only do we have a pay discrepancy, but understandably, we also have a discrepancy in leadership and in hiring promotions by sex in the nonprofit space, which is bad. I hope I didn't need to tell that to you. So now let's break it down by age. And here's something that's fascinating if you look locally. What we know is that households under 25 are more likely to struggle significantly more than their counterparts. But then looking at that grayscale on the right, we know that there's actually not a lot of households where the head of the household is under 25. There's still, a non-zero amount. And so it still is especially valuable to be dealing with those young adults and those young parents in our communities. And young parents, especially those under 25, do need more support than others, especially if they don't have family around to support them by providing an extended support structure. But what we know is the second highest rate is those 65 and over. What's interesting for those 65 and over is the poverty rates maintain pretty stable once you start getting into the workforce from 25 all the way up. But ALICE thresholds are jumping way higher when you're 65 plus. That's because individuals 65 and over have social safety nets, things like Social Security, things like Medicare. They have services that are able to provide them that keep them out of poverty. But those social safety nets are not enough to get them above the ALICE threshold. And a lot of these individuals are retired. They're on fixed incomes, but they do not have fixed expenses. We see this time and time again with rents going up, with income staying the same, and more of our older adults are feeling that burden. I'll give you an example in which we prepare at United Way Suncoast free tax assistance. We do free tax prep for individual households, and we did probably around 10,000 returns this past tax year for families, netting around $11 million in refunds into our community. And as Maria mentioned, she hired me to run the VITA program 9 years ago. And even though I'm not running the VITA program anymore, I volunteer every single year because I like it. I was at Turning Points the last week of tax season helping people out. And what I find as we're doing taxes is more and more older adults, 60, 70. I did taxes for an 82-year-old man this year who was looking at me and was trying to figure out how many hours he could work in an additional job before it started adding more tax to his Social Security. That 82-year-old man should not be working. He should be retired. But he has to in order to make ends meet. And we see this in our community of households, especially with those that are well past retirement age, that are coming back into the workforce, that are coming back into needing nonprofit aid. And to show you how many people are struggling in that age, here's a line graph showing over time the chart that we were just talking about. And so what we see here is this is running from 2010 all the way up to 2023, breaking it down by color in the ages. So the darkest blue are under 25, that light blue is 25 to 44, our goldenrod is 44 to 64, and the very poorly colored gray is from 65 and over. And what we see is that things were about stable from 2010 all the way through 2019 for almost that entire decade. People were struggling, but there was some stability there. From 2019 to 2023, you see our populations, especially our older populations, are ballooning with those that are below ALICE, to the point in which our senior community, age 65 plus, have seen a nearly 50% increase in the number of households below that ALICE threshold. This is troubling, my friends. This shows that there are more and more older adults who are struggling in our communities and who need more and more support as we go in. The current systems that we have in place that say that if you're able to work all your life, you build up retirement, scant retirement that you have, especially if you're in that ALICE space. And keep in mind that if you're in ALICE throughout your workforce, you're probably not being able to put a lot toward retirement. And so in the most case, you're probably just relying on Social Security in order to get by. And that's just not going to cut it anymore, which is unfortunate. And now lastly, before we jump into some questions and I tell you one more story, I do want to break this down by race and ethnicity. What we see is Hispanic and Black households struggle significantly more than their racial counterparts. This is true by poverty. This is probably no surprise to anyone on this call. But what I do want to put your attention to is those ALICE thresholds. Because again, for example, if you're looking in Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties in Florida, and you look at our Black community, yes, there are higher rates of poverty, looking about 15%, but what we see is more than 60% of our Black households in our community is ALICE or below. And so again, this is probably no surprise to you all that there is this discrepancy, but knowing the magnitude of it, again, helps us build solutions to our entire community so that everybody can thrive. And we see here that not everybody is thriving. And then I just want to break this down again in that nonprofit space. So here we have that same chart, but now we're looking at the median wages of everyone. And again, when you're looking in this space, what we see is that Asian and white households significantly have higher rates of median annual wages compared to Black, Hispanic, and also American Indian and Alaska Native populations. And even when you're talking about the median ALICE the median annual wage for workers below ALICE, that actually stabilizes a bit. But when I say stabilizes, it means it makes the median annual wage at $30,000. Now, again, this is national data. I don't want to compare it too closely to our local data, but keep in mind that $30,000 is not going to pay for your rent and your childcare and your food. And so you're going to struggle. And to that point, the percentage of households below that ALICE threshold are considerably higher, in which, again, we see that our Black and Hispanic households, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native, are running around those third of all families, so 33, 35, and 34% respectively, compared to 17% for white households. And what is also interesting is that if you remember the difference between male and female when we had a similar chart like this, right? We had it where we saw that women were making considerably less than men, but women tended to be having their wage below the threshold, yet the household age above the ALICE threshold, if you remember that slide. If you take this one, for example, though, what you see is that that necessarily isn't showing the same factors here, right? Our Black and Hispanic households were 26 and 29%, compared to white being 30%, Asian being 22, right? So the variance here is a bit more murky than what we saw with the genders. So I just threw a lot of data at you. And it's fine if you don't remember everything, because all of these PowerPoints and PDFs will be sent to you that have this data. And I would strongly encourage you to download that nonprofit report. But what do we do about this, right? I wanted to save some time at the end of this hour because I don't want to just be depressing. I don't want us to just be sad and realize that things are harder and more people are struggling, because you see that every single day. You know that. You're in the nonprofit space. You are serving our community day in and day out. You are caring for our families. And so I want to end on this area of hope, that what I have seen is a lot of our nonprofits banding together to have conversations about how we can build a solution for our community collaboratively. There's been a lot of groups and nonprofits having conversations, not just with other nonprofits, but having conversations with businesses, having conversations with government entities, talking about how we can build greater collaboration together, which has been really exciting to see, right? There have been a lot more businesses coming together saying, how do we become a part of this? How do we can get involved? How can we help to build solutions for our community? And that, the more collaborative spaces that we have, the more times we have businesses and nonprofits and local governments coming together collaboratively to talk about solutions, the better that we can build those, right? I work on, I'm a member of a food convening that Bishop Parker has brought in that's been having conversations for months and months now around food convenings, where they've brought together those groups to say, how can we address these problems and how can we build sustainable solutions? So a huge thank you to the space of Manatee Community Foundation for housing those meetings, as well as having Bishop Parker to lead them, because that is where we build success. But we can't just have one convening to reach solutions, right? We need to reinforce our efforts around the levers that need to be pulled for our communities to be stable. And we know through the research that that is building a strong education base and strong financial stability that leads to financial security for our families and for our communities. We also know, though, that not everyone gets this just yet. And so we need to educate and advocate about the real magnitude of those in need, right? You all in the nonprofit space, you're probably the choir, and I am preaching to you, which is why I was able to drill down a little deeper into the data this time around, because I probably didn't need to convince you that there's a need to get involved and a need to help changing the way that we do our work in our community in order to help everyone thrive. But a lot of people don't necessarily have that same history. They need information to be able to know that this is the situation of their neighbors. And so we all need to continue to advocate and advance practices to help people have enough to get by. And so as we're doing this, I would strongly encourage you all to please reach out to United Way Suncoast if there is a way that we can collaborate with you all. We are really interested in talking about ways to build stronger collaboratives in our community, to get partners talking to partners so that we can do better work collaboratively, and in sharing resources and best practices to help people be the most successful they can be, right? Again, I mentioned I volunteered at Turning Points doing the VITA program. You know, that's one thing where we love and would love to collaborate with any of you to be able to provide access to free tax preparation in your space where you see community members, right? If you got a couple of volunteers that are interested, we can get them trained up and rolling in order to be able to serve our communities and serve them well. The more we can collaborate together, the more we can truly build a cohesive community where we can be successful. And so I want to spend about 10 minutes or so at the end with questions to make sure that I answer all of those burning questions that you may have. And so, are there any questions in the chat? Oh, I see one. Sorry, yes.
Hey, Doug, I see one. What can we do to help our ALICE employees?
So there's a few things you can do to help your ALICE employees. So one is making sure that you have what's known as ALICE-friendly workplace practices. And so a lot of families and a lot of businesses come up to me like that and say, well, what can I do? You know, I've looked at my budget, I've looked at how much I'm being able to pay individuals, and I can't pay them more, right? This happens a lot in the nonprofit space because, as Maria mentioned, a lot of our individuals are grant funded, right? And so we simply don't have the budget to give everyone $100,000 and be great, right? Because if we could, that would solve all of our problems. And so the other thing to look at is, well, how do we operate our practices in a way that can be supportive to our ALICE families? This goes to the conversation I mentioned about building solutions for single parent households that help all parent households. And so having conversations about flexibility in the workplace. How often are you all doing flexible hours, flexible scheduling in your work? That way you're not forcing everybody to show up at 8 and clock out at 5. But if maybe somebody does have to drop their kids off at camp and camp doesn't start until 8:15, how can you be more flexible to that space? So offering flexibility in those areas, looking at some of your HR policies and other guidelines that can help you understand where families can be a bit more flexible. There are a lot of really good tools that are out there that can help be a great I would say benchmark for some of these pieces. And so, you know, there are guidelines about building a parent-friendly workplace, you know, about building other policies and supports that go up through that space. So that's one way. Another way to do it is offering different types of wellness services that are out there. And so again, Maria mentioned one of them, United Way has another one. You know, they're all fantastic resources in seeing how can you offer financial wellness as an employee benefit, just as you offer health and physical wellness. as an employee benefit. So talking about ways that you can have those conversations about financial wellness to your communities and to your employees so that they can build up their strength and services as well. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Another way, and the last thing that I'll add before I go into the next question is, frankly, survey your employees to get an understanding of what is the case of your community. So for example, what we use is the CFPB. It's a national tool, uses something called the Financial Wellbeing Scale. It's a valid and reliable tool that's only 10 questions. It's really short, but it measures how everyone's financial wellness is. You know, do people feel financially secure? And what we found is we've actually had conversations with employers that have mentioned that, you know, yes, I'm sure Alice exists, but not here. And then they take the survey and surprise, it's there too. And so it all does start with having an awareness of your employees, which can help build that out. I do see another question here of why are we using conservative survival budget amounts? Is there a way to report or use a range instead? Yes, this is a wonderful question, only because I have a wonderful answer to it. But no, whoever, it was an anonymous attendee. Thank you for asking this question. I do want to let you know, if you do go to our website, unitedwaysuncoast.org, and look at the ALICE data, what you can see is actually what I've been talking about is something known as the survival budget. There is something that is the ALICE stability budget. And so the ALICE stability budget uses considerably more, I would say, average amounts instead of conservative amounts. Now, I use conservative amounts, honestly, so that it's harder to poke holes in the argument, right? I've had conversations where if you use the stability amount, people are like, oh, I could probably get food for cheaper than and they probably could, because these are just averages, and averages necessarily mean that 50% are paying more and 50% is paying less. And so we use survival budgets just to show more conservative estimates of these costs, because again, even with conservative estimates, what we still see is 43% of our community struggling. We still see it costing over $100,000 for a family of 4 to get by. Even with conservative estimates, we think, or we see that families are struggling, and a lot of them are. And so, yes, so you're welcome to use the stability budget instead, again, on United Way Suncoast website in order to get a more accurate showing. And again, we just do this in order to provide more conservative estimates so that people can spend more time on action and less time on scrutiny of the data. Now, if you are someone who loves scrutiny of data, which I know some of you are, there is also a methodology page that is on the website for you to be able to look at all of the calculations that go into creating every single one of those dollar amounts, which are really, really valuable. So does anyone else have any questions? I'm always happy to answer them. But if not, I can end with the story.
Doug, one more question. Could you elaborate on the impact of the enormous immigration specific to the Hispanic Latino component? We in Manatee County have seen a growth from under 10% just 10 plus years ago to over 30% right now. And those populations have different needs, different ways to culturally communicate and approach them and search information. And so how do we see the impact of that influx of population, and how can we support them best?
Yes, so there's a lot there. And so I'll try to answer at least the couple questions that I had there. So one, how does the influx of the number of individuals in Hispanic and Latino population impact our communities? Well, there, we actually don't have specific data on that because we don't have a breakdown of the number who's come in or out who are by different racial and ethnic demographics. And so what we do know is there are considerably more households that are struggling. And again, looking at the chart, we do know that we have about 10% of our Hispanic household in poverty and about 50% of our Hispanic households are struggling below that ALICE threshold. And those percentages have maintained pretty consistently over the years. Now, the question is, are there more? Well, you already said, yes, there are, right? You have the data on those places. And so what we can do is to increase the amount of supports and services for our entire community that can also be targeted in ways that people can understand it and don't have barriers to accessing those supports, right? And so a great example of that, and I'll talk to you from the very basic to the more complicated. The very basic, of course, is making sure that you have information in multiple languages, right? And when I say multiple languages, I don't just mean English and Spanish, but understanding what are the demographic breakdowns in your community and adjusting accordingly. Yes, Spanish will be the next highest one, but we also have very high pockets of places that need Haitian Creole or Vietnamese or, you know, other areas like that. We've actually had a pretty high Ukrainian population that's come in the past few years. And so offering some supports there, right? Having the language as the bare minimum to make sure that people can read your services when they're asking for them. Now, you brought up an interesting question of one of culture. I have 2 minutes left. And the answer there is larger than 2 minutes. So I'll try to give a very short answer, which understandably will be insufficient to probably answer what you're looking for. But make sure that your work is reflective of a way where people feel welcomed into the space, right? People will not be able to access services. They won't reach out if they don't feel like it's a welcome and trusting and respectful environment, right? Areas where people don't feel that level of welcome, they don't feel that level of respect, and they don't feel that level of trust aren't going to be willing to connect with you or reach out. And so again, for the sake of time, that's probably another hour right there. But for the sake of time, again, at the very basic, making sure that you provide some levels of information so that if someone is reaching out, they have the ability to understand what you offer. And then at that higher level, making sure that you create a trusting and welcoming environment. So are there any other questions? I do see we have 1 minute left.
I think, Doug, it's time for your closing story. And promptly after you finish, we will close out the webinar and share the recording in the future.
So the story is longer than minutes, so I'll just use the short version, which is when we do this work, what we know is that when an individual comes into us, we don't know their history and we don't know their story. The short version of our story is I was out doing service to the community and I found an individual who literally the exact same birthday as me, which I found really interesting. August 5th, and I won't tell you the year. But they had the exact same birthday. And as we were talking about our lives, we had very similar lives up until a point where our lives diverged pretty dramatically to no fault of the person who I was talking to. And so it helps us understand that we all live very different lives, each and every one of us. And a lot of those families, when we look at Alice, are families whose lives have diverged into struggle. And these individuals are smart. These individuals are resourceful. These individuals are working and working hard to make ends meet. But the simple matter of fact is that a lot of families are not being able to make it. And so we need to understand as we work with our families that we need to treat, regardless of who comes into us, whether it's a community member or a donor or just somebody off the street, we treat them with respect. We treat them with kindness because we don't necessarily know their story. And if you all do have an extra minute, I would encourage you always to ask somebody what their story is if you have 5 minutes when you're sitting next to somebody, because their stories are fascinating. Every single human being has a fascinating story. And those stories don't diminish, but enhance their lives. And once you know those stories and know those people, we are a lot more willing to get engaged to make sure that everyone does have that financial security to be successful. So that's a short version. Find me in a corner sometime when we're in person and I'll tell you the long version. Thank you all so much for your time and support. Have a great day.
Thank you, Doug. You've been fantastic. We will share your information, continue the great work, and have a wonderful day, everyone.